This is Macroanalytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Gord Long. It's my pleasure to have with me this morning Charles Hugh Smith, well-known and prolific writer on the web, who is the publisher of the well-recognized, well-followed website of2minds.com. Welcome back, Charles.
Thank you, Gordon. Always a pleasure.
It's quick how quick the month goes, but we missed last month for various reasons, one of which you being in Hawaii. And, having grown up in northern Canada, up in the Yukon, Whitehorse, Yukon specifically, in northern Saskatchewan, I'm envious, Charles.
Well, as you know, a lot of Canadians do go to Hawaii for the winter, and they're called snowbirds, and they're a big part of the Hawaiian economy. So,
well, I take my boat and I head to Key West, so so maybe someday. But anyway, Charles, let's just jump right into this. I really wanted to talk about cycles today and what's happening with mood shifts and behaviors that you see in those cycles, but leading to really a springboard from Trump, his election, and not politically on Trump, but what Trump represents in some changes in attitude and changes that I believe are coming politically and political instability in Europe. We're going to see the Italian referendum. We've seen Brexit, but it's all the way through Europe. We're seeing in France, Germany, Holland, whether it's a rejection of EU, rejection of globalism, there's a rejection of the status quo. Some of the issues we saw in our elections, we're seeing around the world. So, and I think we could trace those right back to cycles and mood shifts, possibly. But I wanted to speculate on that. Any comments before I begin?
Yeah, Gordon, I think what we're seeing is Trump is a manifestation of much larger, deeper dynamics. And these dynamics tend to follow these long cycles. And whether they're 25 years, 50 years, 75 years, you can pick a day or a time lapse. But there are these deep cycles of human of action. And we're seeing that play out. And Trump is a manifestation, not a cause necessarily, but a manifestation.
Yeah, he says that he's just a messenger for this movement that I think shocked him. It certainly caught everybody, the mainstream media, off guard, and as a change. And I think that that's part of what it is. But I have up here a chart that of some cycles. I interviewed Harry Dent earlier this year, and he spent his whole career on cycles and specific demographics and the shifts in demographics and what they mean in cycles. And the cycles, the four most popular that he uses, I have here, and they're different time frames, and there's different reasons for them that he has. And I'll reference the people our listeners to that interview I did. I have it over at the Financial Repression Authority, which I'm a co-founder of. But what's important on the chart is you'll notice that they're all heading south now. 3 of the 4 cycles are all heading down, and do head down through to, before they look like they reverse, the very beginnings of 2020. So the next 3 years, he's projecting some pretty serious kinds of issues that are based on this mood shifts well, actually it's demographics, specifically baby boomers shifting their buying behavior, their buying patterns, the reduced birth rates in the developed world, and therefore more entitlement money with less people to pay for it, etc. So there's some very strong underpinnings, but a lot of it just is a generational kind of issues. Comments there, Charles, on that one?
Right, and demographics is connected, of course, to economics, as you just described. Large generations of young people generate more expansion because they're starting families and buying all the stuff that you need to do. And then as populations age, then you get stagnation because there's a much smaller group of young people who are starting out, and old people are consumers, not producers, right? They're consumers of healthcare and other services, and so it skews the economy, and you can't really you can moderate that kind of generational impact, but you can't eradicate it.
Precisely, precisely. The next one I have up is a completely different basis for it. Is some work by Martin Armstrong, who I also interviewed, and you can reference the video interview with him too on the details of it. But his are actually millennial kinds of cycles. He went right back to the Roman days. Of course, we didn't have the financial tracking, but tried to look at events in history, and from there he built his cycles. And they're like in a 200-year kinds of cycles. And you'll notice how he even puts dates on this down to decimal places versus months and days, because he kind of has a different calendar approach on it. But the point I would bring out here, whether he's right or wrong, and by the way, he has been consistently right for a lot of years, and made an awful lot of money and consulted around the world in currencies specifically because of these shifts. But if you look at it, you can see he's got the same he believes we're already on the downside of this pattern, but also right through to the early part of 2020 and now downside. So it absolutely correlates with the work that Harry Dent did. And the next chart, we'll move right along, is a well-known cycle theory, is the Kondratieff cycle, the long wave cycle, and a lot of people are very strong believers in it. And according to it, we should now be entering it's a four seasonal kind of approach to the fourth season, the winter season. And that's where we start to, economies start contract, mood shift occurs. But the point I'd make on this one, Charles, if you can really see the details, you'll notice that debt always falls off. It's like the end of a debt cycle. It collapses. It's a 55-year generational. So like we get used to austerity, and then we get a little bit more, and we get into credit, and then we get kind of carried away. It ties into the debt jubilee of every 7 years, every 55 years also in debt cycles. But if you look at this chart, debt hasn't fallen off. It's only gone up. So it's delayed this Kondratieff winter cycle until something happens here on the credit, and that goes back to what I believe is we're now entering the end of the super debt cycle potential. But it's again the same kind of cycle theory is saying we got a down period in the next few years. Comments?
Right, Gordon, because the debt cycle is you can become over indebted. In other words, you're no longer traditional borrowing. You're simply borrowing on a crumbling foundation. And so, and Marty Armstrong's work on the Roman devaluation of the currency has fascinated many of us for years, because you can either devalue your currency or you can borrow until your currency collapses. But whichever variation you use, you're no longer creating wealth. You're simply borrowing against future earnings, and eventually that debt overwhelms your ability to create income and wealth. And then that leads to the political problems, which Peter Turchin's new book describes. And we were talking about it before we started recording. That you visualize this as this process of financial debt problems becoming political problems as part of an XY axis. And I thought that was fascinating.
Yeah, I really believe, and I put out a number of papers during the financial crisis or just after it, that I believe then that we were in the middle of a financial crisis that would mutate itself over the next, and I thought 5 to 7 years. We're now in 7 going to 8 years, but we would move to an economic crisis, and I believe we're passing through that. And then after that, it would lead to a political crisis because of all the issues, financial and economic, undermining the social contract. The government, the lack of faith in government, the lack of belief in the system, crumbling entitlements, etc., would unfold. And at the same time, the financial underpinnings, if you remember 2008, well, I know you remember very well, it was about collateralized debt obligations, CDSs, but the securitization elements broke down on asset-backed securities. But it would mutate as we went through it to the the final crisis political would be a breakdown in the global swaps marketplace, and then that's a $600 to $700 trillion that very few people have any visibility or understanding of would start to break down, and it would break down because of currency volatility and bond volatility, yield volatility, which it's that the swaps market base is primarily based on interest and currency swaps. And by the way, haven't you noticed interest rates absolutely going straight up since Trump was elected on a relative basis, and the U.S. dollar is just going through the roof as other currencies in the emerging markets are getting killed. I'm not trying to say there's therefore a crisis imminent. I'm just trying to say we're mutating to exactly that pattern that I was reflecting with this X and Y axis.
Right. And so I want to bring up a couple of other writers. We have a chart here of Peter Turchin's work, and there's other historian, like socio-economists, I would call them, such as David Hackett Fisher, who's talked about the long wave of price. And of course, prices reflect inflation, the cost of money, the decline of wealth generation. And Joseph Tainter, his work on the eventual cost of complexity. And so there's a lot of other dynamics here beyond demographics and financial, but they all end up, as you are saying, end up impacting the political and socioeconomic sectors. And so Peter Turchin's work identified three dynamics. One is stagnation of real wages, which we've seen for the last 15 years, right? A overproduction of parasitic elites, meaning people who aren't producing anything. They're just sucking the wealth off of other people. And
isn't that really what the whole entire financial community, financialization is moving paper and credit and claims around? But in actual fact, and I'm not trying to disparage it because I live in that world, you don't produce anything physically, okay?
That's right.
And you have to produce something physically to trade globally to really sustain, to create real wealth. And wealth can only be created by growing it, mining it, or building it. You can't print it.
Right, right. And when the financialization or financial sector was, say, 2 or 3% of the economy, it was acted as a tax. In other words, the parasitic elites are like a tax on the system. When they're a modest amount of the whole economy, we can support it. But now it's like 17 to 20%, right? And then we've got healthcare, which is an inefficient sort of tax on the whole system. That's, almost 20%. So we're piling up all these, the kind of deadwood.
And then add to that is the amount that the government is now part of the GDP, whether the federal, state, or local, an amount that it's now consuming of the GDP, and then passing it back in terms of entitlement to create more consumption of money that was created by the government. So where's the real wealth creation? That's the point I would like to make. It disappears. And so you have this elitist parasites.
And then his third point is what you just spoke to, which is deterioration in the central state finances. In other words, overpromising entitlements and benefits that cannot be paid off of the actual, tax base. And so there you go. That's how you get a political, you get an economic stagnation and degradation, and then it becomes a political and social issue. And that's what you spoke to at the beginning of the program. This is not unique to the U.S. or even Europe, that look at Japan, stagnation for 20 plus years. China has a lot of its own issues, which it's papering over with vast expansion of debt, but it's got its own demographic cycles that are turning negative, right? The workforce is declining, and the number of elderly people in China is set to soar in the next decade too. So it is a global phenomenon we're talking about.
Yeah, because these Turchin is putting some real meat on these cycles and reason for the cycles, but they're at the most basic. They're driven by two things: either behavioral shifts, and those behavioral shifts are generational and cyclical because they're based on learning and experience through generations, and attitudes that you learn and change and are forgotten, lessons that we continuously have to keep learning from one generation to the next. But at the same time, they're also, what overlays it and makes it confusing is there's mood shifts. and changes in mood and behavior. It's like the sun comes out, full moon or whatever. Astrology, we don't need to get into this, but there's definitely global shifts in mood, and that's one of the bigger drivers that's going on right now. I've done a lot of digging and reading over the years, and have been a big follower of the Elliott Wave principle by Bob Pritchard, or by Prechter rather, Robert Prechter, and though I'm not trying to say Elliott Wave principle works consistently. What is really fascinating is he started a whole new area called socioeconomics. And when you get into the work that they do, which is looking at trying to understand these mood cycles and shifts and why they happen, which underpins, by the way, the whole Elliott Wave principle for the technicians that do follow it. And I'm showing some charts here now that their work has really demonstrated, or is demonstrating, the shifts that are happening in mood, the polarization that's happening within politics, and why that is beginning to happen as you get more and more people who are more fixed in their ways, less forgiving of others, less attuned to wanting to cooperate. And this becomes the parts of the cycle, becoming from optimistic to pessimistic, where you go from wanting to cooperate to not wanting to cooperate, where you believe and you're optimistic to where you're cynical and not and less forgiving. And clearly they're showing here in these charts that shift has been well underway. So the question then is, well, where is it all leading to? And we get I see these shifts in Europe. And this chart shows you where that's been happening in Europe. And then this next chart here, Charles, shows a roadmap that next week we have the Brexit, the referendum in Italy. But if you go through, and I think that could potentially be a significant event, by the way. But then if you follow the roadmap, there's one event after the other that has just as big an issue as Trump, just as big an issue as Brexit, whether it's going to be the French elections. Holland's not even going to run. It's already shifting so dramatically there. Merkel looks like she's not going to make it in the next election. Italian election, relevant of what comes out of the referendum, Pepe Brillo is probably in, and Five Star is going to take control. These are anti-globalization, anti-establishment kinds of momentum, and we're seeing the same thing in Holland. Comments on any of that? Charles, I didn't mean to be long-winded, but...
No. I think it's an excellent overview of these charts of social mood that you've identified. And Turchin sort of characterizes these broad, long-term cycles of social mood as either integrative, like people find reasons to cooperate and work together, and that generates optimism. And then there's these disintegrative stages where, as you say, people find reasons to not cooperate. They develop these identities and sort of tribal loyalties that break down the larger social network and social contract. And we should mention that the Fourth Turning fellows, the analysts who wrote the book The Fourth Turning, which traces out like an 80-year cycle in U.S. history that they extend back before the founding of the U.S. But again, another cycle. Their cycles are based on generational crises, but we're also talking about the overlay here of generational crises with debt crises, with political crises, and with this the broad failure, if you will, of the status quo of reliance on debt and reliance on globalization, and turning the world into a market in which there's a few winners and a lot of losers. And of course, the losers are becoming restive, as we could easily imagine, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so what I think our key point here is there's a lot of cyclical analysis that is, if you overlay all these different people's work, we find ourselves in that disintegrative winter stage of however you want to describe it. And we've talked a lot, Gordon, about how do we deal with this? I mean, obviously the systems that worked for 60 years are no longer working. And we can either try to cling to that sinking boat and go down with the ship, or we can break out of that paradigm and start looking for solutions beyond the paradigms we've been using for 60 years since the end of World War II.
And that's what's trying to happen right now. It is where there's a need to change systems. They're old systems. There's old ways of doing it. Technology's allowed us to do so much more, but somehow, the social contract is now broken down. Governments are not delivering an environment that allow people to really advance. They're being burdened with debt, lack of opportunities, etc., and that frustration. So that's a sign that it's change trying to happen, and that's what this whole political instability I see occurring. It's not negative. It's going to lead. There will be some casualties, but it will lead to the kinds of change that's needed, that needs to occur. And you know, Charles, we started with this globalization, and I have up here a chart from, as I mentioned, on the socioeconomics on globalization and their work. And you know, they were out in 2008. John Cassidy, he was a Dr. Cassidy, was presenting cycles and patterns on he felt was going to globalization would reverse, and then you would start to get into tariff issues, protection issues, breakdown of free trade, fair trade, as we're now the buzzwords that are now every night in the news, at least coming from Trump and Europe. But he was predicting this would happen, and let me read a quote that he had that came out in. Actually, it goes back to 1992, not him. It was Prechter that came out, and he said, and I quote him: major bear markets are accompanied by a reduction in the size of people's unit of allegiance, the group that they consider to be like themselves. At the peak, there is perceived brotherhood of men and nations. In other words, at a peak, it's all we. Everyone is a potential friend. At a bottom, it's all they. Everyone is a potential enemy. When times are good, tolerance is greater and boundaries weaker. When times are bad, intolerance for differences grows, and people build walls and fences to shut out those perceived to be different. Prechter wrote that in 1992, and he was talking about these evolutional cycles. Does that resonate with what we're seeing today?
Absolutely. Brilliant description.
Yeah, that's what I felt, and I'm trying to also, to make some sense to our listeners of this is not a mixed bag of discussions. It is integrated. Maybe we're not smart enough to really integrate it that well, Charles, but there's some investment decisions in here too that you can start to make, because, and I believe we have a fuse that's with an explosive that's going to ignite it, and we have a catalyst to ignite it all, and it's all built in here, and that is the fuse. The analogy I'd use is the fuse is the debt supercycle. That's what we have ticking here right now, and it's been lit, and it's going to end at some point. Who knows when? The explosive is this whole fiat paper reserve system, paper currency system that we have that's unbacked. We're printing money like drunken sailors, and it says at some point it comes to an end. The credit, the debt, all come together and collapse. That's the explosive. I believe the igniting catalyst for that, because it can go on and has been going on for a long time, and you can lose a fortune as it continues to go on. But the catalyst for it, to me, and as it goes back to that grid I was talking about, political, economic, or rather financial, economic, and then political, is I believe it's going to end in the $500 to $700 trillion swaps marketplace finally imploding. And the reason I believe that, it's all centered out of interest rate swaps and currency swaps and what's happening right now with the US dollar. It's killing the rest of the world. Emerging markets, because it's so strong, and it's a flight to perceived safety, which is, look at the Zimbabwe, what's happening there. Look what's happening in Venezuela. Look at what's happening with some of the pegs that are under currency pegs because of this continuously raising dollar. And now with Trump, the bond market is absolutely collapsing as interest rates, the 10 years went from, like last summer, 1.3, 1.4 to nearly 2.5 yesterday. I mean, these are massive moves with nothing more than an election out of expectations. But that's just fine. But do you know what that means when you're highly leveraged in a $700 trillion swaps market based on collateral values of currencies and bonds? Remember, when interest rates go up, the value of the bond goes down. Okay, so you're losing money on it. So this is where the explosive problem could be. Does that make sense to you, Charles? Was I too convoluted in explaining that?
No, I don't think so, Gordon. And what we're talking about here is when systems stop working, when they stop becoming efficient and more productive, and they start becoming a tax on the remaining engines of wealth and income creation, we've just been papering it over for decades with additional debt. In other words, we don't fix anything in healthcare or national defense or higher education. We simply borrow trillions and trillions and trillions of more dollars, yuan, yen, and euros to paper it over. And we haven't really fixed anything. And that's what the debt super cycle is all about. You try to fix everything with just borrowing more. And eventually that becomes a mountain of debt that you cannot possibly pay back, and it collapses. And so, as you say, in that, the waning stages of that, you get hyperinflation in weak currencies like Venezuela. Apparently, according to articles on Zero Hedge, I mean, the currency has lost 15% of its value in a day or two, and a third in a matter of days. This is what you get when the debt super cycle on the mountain of debt collapses or implodes. And so the disruptions that were just sort of touched upon are just starting. As you say, as interest rates rise, it's going to totally disrupt the entire global economy.
You got it. And by the way, everybody says, you guys are just being negative. Look at how well the stock market's doing. Well, by the way, go look at the Venezuelan stock market and the Zimbabwe market, and you'd say, oh, they must be doing bad. They're going through the roof. They make our market look like it's going nowhere. So don't use the stock market as your barometer necessarily. Because as we learned in 1986, and 2000 and 2008, 7 years of profits can disappear within a matter of weeks. Okay. But I think, just to wrap here, Charles, what it's saying to me is these generational issues associated with cycles, whether they're mood or behavioral driven, whatever, they're all signaling that we say, well, how long will it go on? We all say it can't go on indefinitely. Well, all the cycles are saying, well, between now and 2020, something is going to start correcting in here. And so I just caution everybody to be cautious right now. Maybe not. It doesn't say anything's going to happen this week or next week, or maybe in the early part of Trump's presidency. But somewhere in this 4 years of his presidency, which takes us through 2020, there's going to be some very serious headwinds in here. And that's not a comment on Trump. I think he's just going to face some challenges. And let's hope he does something right for us, right here, Charles. Any closing comments you'd like to make?
Just to reiterate that all these social and political sort of disruptions or changes that we've been mentioning, to me, they are all manifestations of these deep cycles. If it wasn't Trump, it would be somebody else. The status quo is crumbling because it's no longer functioning efficiently or productively, right? And that's the core issue here. And when we're talking about the financial disruptions, we have to differentiate between those activities that are creating real income, real collateral, real wealth, and everything else. And a lot of what we think of as wealth is actually not creating wealth or income, right? It's been built on the creation of somebody else's wealth or some other engine of income. So we just need to look at what real wealth and real income are, and that's going to be my focus over the next 4 years, right? Is that it's going to sort the wheat from the chaff.
Precisely. Charles, I always enjoy these discussions, and I hope our listeners get something out of it. I know every time I talk to you, I learn something else and get a different idea, so that's why I enjoy them very much. Tell our listeners how they can follow all your writings, because you put out a new missive every single day.
Please visit me at of2minds.com.
Thank you very much, Charles. Talk to you again next month.
Okay. Thank you, Gordon.
Bye.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.